And just to confirm on the time, so the calendar invitation has an hour and a half, but the
Yeah,
target is around an hour. Is that correct?
yeah. But if you feel that depending on how things are going, if you feel
Yeah.
that we can extend to 1 hour and a half, 1 hour and a
Yep.
quarter, you feel free.
Yep. Okay. And yeah, most likely that will be questions. It won't be me sharing any content. So I'm happy to stay on for as long as we need.
Okay. Well, I'll start in 3 minutes. Então, são 19h10. Vamos bater o centro. Kickoff. Joia. Muito bem. Gente, muito boa noite. Deixa eu olhar para a câmera aqui, que tem mania de não olhar. Muito boa noite a todos. É uma honra muito grande estar aqui nesse webinar, né? Tivemos aí quase 300 pessoas inscritas. Vamos esperar. A média é 10% das pessoas aparecerem, né? Então vamos esperar aí que a gente tenha algo entre 25 e 30 pessoas ao vivo, né? E a gente está aqui com a ilustre presença do Christian Young. A gente vai, o Paulo vai fazer já já a apresentação dele. A gente tem o apoio aqui do Hugo, do Paulo, grande idealizador desse webinar. A gente tem aqui o apoio luxuosíssimo do Gustavo Duca, que veio aqui. A gente estava com saudade do Duca, né? O Duca é o nosso quarto elemento, né? E a gente tem a elegante, rápida e perspicaz tradução do Felipe Brito. Eu quero ver ele traduzir perspicaz por Christian. Te vira, Felipe. Então vamos lá, gente. O que é que a gente veio fazer aqui hoje, hein? A gente veio falar sobre CCM. No nosso belíssimo português, é Gerenciamento de Controles Críticos. É sobre isso que o Christian vai falar com a gente, beleza? Então, olha
Ah,
só. Diga, ô Paulo,
Tival, quer começar a gravar?
já está gravando?
Ah, já. Ok.
Já está gravando. Obrigado por lembrar. Mas a gravação foi automática, né? Joia. Tem que desbloquear, Duca, a função aqui, tá? Mas você pode clicar em Everyone. Aqui, Send Chat to Everyone.
No meu não aparece everyone, no meu aparece
Tá
só a
bom,
gente.
tá joia. Então eu vou... Escreve para mim que eu copio e colo. Eu vou já corrigir o chat. Toda vida tem esse probleminha. O Zoom é bem chatinho para a gente liberar o chat. Eu vou já conseguir fazer isso. Beleza? Joia. Então eu já faço isso. Aqui, então, pessoal, dá uma olhada no chat. Essa é a proposta do Christian. A gente começar aqui para vocês colocarem no Q&A, tá? Coloca lá para vocês interagirem e aí a gente vai traduzindo, a gente vai lendo e aí o Felipe traduz para o Christian. Coloca no chat. Quais são as nossas maiores dúvidas e as nossas maiores preocupações sobre controles críticos? Ok? Já coloca isso que a gente já vai lendo por Christian. Que diabos é controle crítico, gente? Então, esse processo de gerenciamento de controles críticos, CCM em inglês, isso aí surgiu como uma resposta à necessidade de melhorar a prevenção de acidentes graves na indústria de alto risco, principalmente mineração e petróleo. Mineração, que é a expertise do Chris, como o Paulo vai apresentá-lo. Ok? Então, tivemos inúmeros desastres e isso impulsionou essa criação de controles críticos, né? Então, controles críticos, a ideia é evitar ou mitigar os impactos de eventos de alto risco. Como é que eu falho de forma segura? Como é que eu mitigo isso, né? Diferentemente do gerenciamento de risco tradicional, que tem muitos controles, a gente poderia até dizer sem um foco muito claro, o CCM concentra-se nas coisas que realmente mata. É aquilo que a gente fala nos nossos treinamentos de Hop e Learning Teams. O que é que verdadeiramente pode matar? Porque muitas vezes a gente está distraído, e aí eu não tenho medo de dizer distraído, procurando luvas, botas, quem não está com os goggles, né? Com os óculos de proteção, e a gente está lá procurando desvios, acreditando em pirâmides e triângulos. Mas o que é que verdadeiramente mata? É sobre isso que o Christian veio falar, e eu vou pedir o Paulo, né, para apresentar um pouquinho. Quem é Christian Young?
All right. Ah, vamos lá, em português, né? Ah, o Christian, na realidade, assim, ele tem, olhando o currículo dele, algo extremamente impecável e admirável. O Christian tem 23 anos de experiência na área de segurança, trabalhou em multinacionais, mais especificamente, a maior parte do tempo dele passou em mineração. Grandes empresas, claro, uma delas a gente pode citar aqui, bem conhecida de todo o público, a BHP, foi gerente global da BHP, ah, Peabody, assim como PwC. Ele morou em Singapura, em UK. Então, assim, ele rodou o mundo, até que em 2000, por volta de 2019, ele resolveu criar sua própria empresa e constituir, então, a sua empresa, a Impress. E com a Impress, então, ele tem ajudado todas essas empresas. Para contexto, ele mora, ele reside no mesmo estado que eu, aqui em Queensland, aonde é a economia do nosso estado, ela roda em torno da mineração. Aqui é carvão. Ah, os dois, para fazer ferro e o carvão para fazer para a indústria de eletricidade. E ele ajuda essas empresas, então, ele é uma pessoa extremamente dedicada para trazer toda a indústria a um outro nível. E aqui, especificamente em Queensland, devido à legislação, e esse é um ponto que o Christian também vai abordar conosco, compartilhando essa inovação da nossa legislação, é que a questão de critical controls, ou gerenciamento de controles críticos, foi recentemente introduzida a legislação. Então, assim, hoje as empresas, além de terem essa proatividade, identificar e gerenciar seus controles críticos, elas também têm uma necessidade do lado ah, de compliance, de legislação, para que esses controles sejam demonstrados sua eficiência. Então, assim, essa bagagem toda eu queria veio aqui, a gente conseguiu um tempinho do Christian para poder compartilhar um pouco da experiência dele conosco. Então, aproveitem. Olá, Christian.
Muito bem, Cris. A bola está com você agora.
Okay. I will share my screen. And hello and good evening. It's nice to be here. Thank you for your time. So we're here to talk about critical controls. And I think the first part is around getting aligned on what is a critical control. In the work that I've done across multiple industries and even across sites within the same company, everyone has a different interpretation on what is a critical control. And so this first slide here is just some words that help us get on the same page. So some principles. A critical control is associated with a type of hazard that could have a significant consequence. It could be a safety consequence, could be an environmental consequence, a community or reputation consequence. Also, this control is, if we took it away or if it failed, then it might have impacts on how likely that consequence could be for us. And also, if it's a control that we see is multiple times, we rely on that across multiple hazards or even in the same risk assessment, then that's a control. And my first question, and this will be a test for our Q&A, does anyone have an example of a critical control that they might want to share that they've come across within their business or in their experience? I'll give 30 seconds to see what people might throw in. And if you guys can read back anything that pops up. So, example of a critical control. Or if no one's putting something in, then
They're mentioning airbags, car airbags.
Airbags. Okay, yep. Anything else from anyone? Control related to a hazard with a significant consequence that's really important.
Let's see. Something else here. Oh, the monitor for a dam, for example, the radar monitor for a dam.
Yep. That's a good one. That's because if we had a failure of a dam, that would be a significant consequence to our organization. That's awesome. That's great. I'll keep moving forwards, but if there's any others that come through, then
Okay, I'll let you know.
And this is a rhetorical question. If we have critical controls related to high consequence events, then the impact, if we don't get them right, is we may experience those high consequence events. And in my experience, and to use a very brutal term, but it's the truth, is people can die. And we don't want that to happen. That's one of the many reasons why we want to get critical controls right. We want to be clear on what they are and clear in understanding how effective they are within our businesses. And this is just some examples here of, unfortunately, fatal incidents. So we know they can have a multitude of causes, be related to a multitude of different hazards. And we want to be able to get clear on what are the critical controls for these particular hazards. So what's a three-part reflective area here? What's the problem around critical controls management? And how do we know there's a problem? Well, we know there's a problem because we're continuing to kill people or have significant incidents or high potential incidents or high potential hazards or risks or repeat incidents. And that's how we know it to be true. And what I will go through to this evening is some key foundational information and some practices that if you are able to move towards or put in place will strengthen your critical control management program and process. About me in less than 30 seconds, and thank you for that introduction, Paolo. So almost 25 years health and safety, primarily in the mining industry. And the mission of our business is to help you save lives at work. And so I and our organization has done critical control management, critical risk management for a number of large mining houses, contractors, and here's just some of the brands that we have worked with and are still working with. Move on from that. So in relation to the content, I will cover as much as I can in the period of time that we have. I want to also have time for questions at the end because that's important for me. If you have a particular question, we'll spend some time on that. And also, the time we have is not enough to cover everything I would like. So I will give you some information on where you can go to get some more information at the end of the presentation. Okay, so one of the principles which Paolo shared with me is understanding what's process safety, what's personal safety, and what may be their relationship to critical risk management. And the flow on there from is in relation to critical controls management. It's actually a really good question. So in the table here, you can see that we have 2 columns, and I'm not sure if everyone can read English, so I'll try and talk to it. We have in the middle column process safety, and in the right-hand side here, the far right-hand side column is personal safety. And we have some aspects that it's asked for. So if we think about, well, what's the intent? I'll just move my mouse here. Intent. Process safety is all about loss of containment type risks, where personal safety is more around unwanted events. And that could be from a variety of reasons. If we think about the consequences, then process safety has fatality, mostly multiple fatalities, but maybe environment, production, legal, cost, all of those other types of aspects, where personal safety, in my experience, is more targeted to single fatality and multiple fatalities, and maybe a little bit of environment or a little bit of community in there as well. The example risks you're probably familiar with if we think processing facilities from a process safety perspective, fires or explosions or significant gas release or something like that. And I've got down here pictured is the Piper Alpha, which maybe a lot of us are familiar with. Whereas in personal safety, if we think about single fatality and multiple fatality risks, so the example falling from height or contact with live electrical conductors, or dropped objects, or tires and rims release, or vehicle collision, which we can see represented here in an industry that I've worked with a lot. In terms of their methodologies, so process safety is a lot more structured and has a very good framework, and their risk assessment tools, which is the next one down, are very technical, be it quantitative or semi-quantitative, with HAZOPs or fault tree analysis or failure modes effects analysis. Whereas in personal safety, it's more you identify the risks and you manage them. So more of that risk-based approach up to the organizations, and the risk assessment tools in there might be a bow tie or workplace risk assessment and control, maybe sometimes some fault tree analysis or event tree analysis. In terms of relevant industries, so process safety is more about, and where we see is those static work environments where it doesn't really change. So think about a processing plant or some of the big plants, where personal safety is more targeted or works better in those dynamic work environments. So that's where we can see, for example, a mining or a construction site, where the environment changes and we need to evolve and move forwards in real time. And in relation to critical controls, which I'll talk about a little bit later, if we look at the critical controls and the nature of our checks on those critical controls, they're more in the system level. So let's say sensors and programming, maybe maintenance strategies almost on the unseen side of things. In the personal safety, so the critical controls there may be the seen. Say, for example, if one of my risks is falling from height, one of my critical controls might be wearing a harness. So that's a seen control that I can see on the job on the day. But there also may be some unseen, system level critical controls in there as well. So hopefully that's helping now paint the picture between those two different worlds. And when it comes to critical risk management, I'll quickly talk about the framework. We start to wonder and reflect on, well, before I say that, let me just move to this model. So some of you on the line may have seen this. Some of you may be seeing this for the first time. This is one framework for critical risk management that was distributed by the International Council of Mining and Metals in 2016. And it's based off a standard risk assessment process: identify risk, analyze risk, control risk, monitor risk, and improve. Something we're all familiar with. And in relation to critical control management, identifying critical controls, putting them in place, and monitoring them, that's a portion of this process. So critical controls is an activity within the critical risk management process and framework. That's a key point. And as I understand it, there's some terminology, and I think you might have mentioned at the start, stuff that can kill you is essentially, that's what we're talking about here in this critical risk management space. So a question, now that we understand a bit more about process safety and personal safety, do you think the critical risk management process can support both of those areas? And it might just be a yes, no. So if we can just monitor the chat and just see what people think.
Vamos lá, moçada, vamos interagir. Olha aí, Chris. Tá rolando aí uns yes e uns sim. Em português, yes é sim.
Okay, so yes.
Yeah.
What are other people
Everybody
saying?
agrees that it's possible. We can.
Okay, so we're seeing some yeses in there.
Yes.
Perfecto.
Nice portion.
Thank you. I made that up just then. So that's correct. In the work that I've done with our industries, there is no difference in the critical risk management process framework in relation to safety risks and also to process safety. They all come through at the top and we all take them through. And therefore both can have critical controls, which is what we're interested in. There is no distinction. We call them a critical risk, or in this terminology, the stuff that can kill you. This is a very busy slide. What this is showing, and I'm not going to go through all parts, is when we execute this process, this critical risk management process in the middle, there are lots of artifacts that are produced that help guide us through this process. And this is the work that we do. And the purpose of today is not to go through all of this, but if you think about here, we're around critical controls. What we're going to talk to, and I'll move to the next slide. We're looking at the critical controls, and this is the area that we're focused in. So within the greater critical risk management framework, we're focusing on critical control management. And what that looks like are some of these activities and some of these artifacts. And that's what I'm going to go through next within the presentation. It's important to recognize that the critical risk management process doesn't start at critical controls. It starts at risk identification. And so when we help clients, sometimes we say, show us your critical controls, and they'll give us a list. And then our next question will be, well, show me your bow tie analysis, which is what you use to identify your critical controls. Or we'll say, show us your broad brush risk assessment, which is the risk assessment process you use to identify your critical risks. And if organizations can't show us that, then we say it doesn't make sense to start at critical controls. It makes sense to go upstream and look at those processes first, because your list of critical controls will be an outcome of those other risk assessments. And so this essentially is, let's say 80% of the critical control management process is in here. Okay. So to recap what we just went through, process safety and personal safety have different areas of focus, different methodologies. They are can be both classed as critical risks. The critical risk management process does not distinguish between them. It's either critical or not. And critical control management is a part of the critical risk management end-to-end framework. I should probably mention too that if anyone has questions, to log them, and then we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So please put in questions as we go through. Okay, so now if we start to hone in on critical control management, then what does good look like? Again, there's lots of different organizations and countries do things differently. So I'll give you my interpretation of what good looks like based on the work that we've done, both technical and the practical. So the first component is around identifying what our critical controls are. And there's some areas here. So you may remember from the greater critical risk management framework, all of our critical controls must come from a risk assessment. Now, the type of risk assessment might vary. What's pictured here is a bow tie analysis, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's the only type of risk assessment that can identify critical controls. For us, we like bow tie because of its process and structured process to then help us identify what are the critical controls on the different pathways. Just going to minimize you guys there. Okay, that's better for me. Okay, so that's point one. And maybe a quick poll. For people on the line that do have critical controls, have they been identified by risk assessment? So that might be a yes/no question and answer. You guys able just to ask that and just monitor that? I can read that. A few yeses.
Yeah, a few yes.
Yes. Sim.
Mais um sim aqui. Sim é yes.
So
Beleza.
kind of like the, middle of the road. Understand. Even I comprehend that one. Yeah.
Aham.
Okay. So the next, or one of the other aspects of identification of critical controls is, firstly, it must meet the definition of a control. So it must be a control first before we even think about, is this going to be critical or not? And so in the work that we do, there are some criteria for a definition. So the first aspect here is a control must be an act, object, or a system. So an act is a human action. For example, 3 points of contact could be an act. An object does not require any human involvement. So an object could be a monitoring device for a tailings dam or a dam. And a technological system or a system is a combination of an act and an object. So an example of that is a seatbelt, where a seatbelt, we have the object component, which is the reel and the strap and those things. And then also we have the human action of wearing the seatbelt. And therefore that's a system. So all of our critical controls, or all of our controls, should be able to be defined in relation to one of those three aspects. And then the second part is it must be associated, designed to prevent or mitigate an unwanted event, and must be specifiable, measurable, and auditable. Or an easier way to say that is it auditable? And so again, this is another poll to the audience. A quick yes, no. If they looked at their critical controls or even their general controls, would most of them meet this criteria?
Vamos lá, galera.
Okay.
Vamos participar.
Sometimes sim. Okay. We'll keep an eye on the chat. So that's the opportunity, and the learning here is if our controls don't meet the criteria to be a control, that's the work we need to do first before we move forwards and think about, is this a critical control? And there are lots and lots of organizations, large mining houses, who have critical controls. And then when I see the list and I look at this criteria, a lot of them don't even meet this criteria. So if that makes you feel any better, everyone, unfortunately, has struggled with this. So if we have a control that passes the criteria, then we need to confirm that I use the term true control. So this is the pathway down the left-hand side, or is it a support activity? So a support activity is something that's designed to maximize the health of the critical control, of the control. So an example of a support activity would be training or would be maintenance. So they are not actually frontline controls, they more support and give health to the control. Or it may be a verification activity. So a verification activity is where something that's in place to confirm or check on the control. So examples of verification activities might be inspections, audits, reports, those types of aspects. So this is now another question back to the audience. This is very Q&A, sorry, very interactive. If they looked at their current list of critical controls or controls, what percentage of them would they think are true controls and not a support activity or a verification activity?
I think we should give people the maybe reading the criteria because it's in English, right, Paul? I don't
Okay,
know.
perfect. I will work through an example. Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay. So we'll work through this using an example. So let's say my example is random alcohol testing of the workforce. So I will work through this. So the question here is random alcohol testing of the workforce, and is it a human act? Is it an act, object, or system? I will go forward and say that this is an act, and therefore the answer is yes, and I'll move forwards to the next question. This question is, does it prevent or mitigate an unwanted event? Now, if we do random alcohol testing, I can't say that it will prevent or mitigate an unwanted event. So my answer will be no. And then I'll move then over to my next question set is it an activity that maximizes the health or minimizes the erosion of a control? Maybe, I'm not certain, but let's say yes. Yes, it is. Is the activity specifiable, observable, and auditable? Well, we have an alcohol procedure that says we do it once a week. So I'll say yes, and then we end up over here as a support activity, as an example. Similarly, if I had a control that was, we will provide an induction to every person that starts with our organization. I could say, is it a human act, object, and system? Maybe I could say it's a system because someone needs to deliver it and we have a package that they deliver. Does it prevent or mitigate an unwanted event? I would say no, it doesn't. Does it minimize the health and minimize erosion of a control? Maybe, again, although some organizations I've seen their inductions are almost non-existent or very poor, and we might end up saying, no, it doesn't, and then we end up over here, so not part of a control management system. So the overriding takeaway here is not all controls that meet the definition of be clear what out of these things we're calling controls actually support a control but are not actually a control, or what out of these verify and check on controls but are not actually a control. We need to get away from just adding lots of things to a list and calling them all controls, and therefore we feel like we're protected. Okay. This next one is around measuring the effectiveness of controls. It's okay if you can't read the slide. I'm not going to work through an example. However, what good looks like is every control that we've identified associated with a critical risk. So let's say a fire or something like that. We have performed a control effectiveness assessment against it, where we understand how good is that control. So could we ask that as a quick poll? Whose organizations currently perform effectiveness assessments on their controls? As a yes, no.
I think that's a really interesting question because we all get busy implementing controls, but whether or not we ever evaluate the effectiveness is the question.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a very good question.
Actually,
Why?
I think we match actually verify the control based on the results. So I think it's the main mistake. If nothing happens, we tend to believe that the control is effective, but I don't know if the relation is 0-1.
Because the follow-on question is, why would we class something as a critical control if it had low effectiveness?
Yes, I think that's the key. Another aspect is like we all have finite resource. Like we don't have resource to spend as much as we want. We need to prioritize. So unless we really know the control is effective, who knows? We would be just wasting money and time on something that has been adding no or little value to our system.
100%.
Yeah.
Okay. So if it passes all of those tests, so it meets the definition of a control, it's a true control and it's not a support activity or a verification activity. We've measured the effectiveness and we've identified that it has good effectiveness as opposed to low effectiveness. Then we can move into the space of working out, is this critical or not, out of the ones that are left. So let's say we started our list from our risk assessment at 50 controls, and now we're down to, let's say, 25 after applying all of that criteria. Now we want to work out from that 25, what are going to be those ones that are critical. And there's a number of tests that we can do here. Most of these definitions we've covered off. So is it critical to preventing one of these critical risks? Interestingly, if it's the only control that may be there for a particular cause, then it might be pointed to the fact that it may need to be critical. If you took away this control, would it significantly increase the risk? As I mentioned, if it's a control that's mentioned multiple times throughout the risk assessment, or across a series of risk assessments, then it may be critical. So an example of that might be our emergency response process, which generally you'll find in most of your risk assessments for critical risks. And I won't worry about the independence bit. So we use, start again. On the right-hand side, for a lot of our clients, when we say, how do you select a critical control? It generally is, we just point and guess. They haven't applied this framework. And the analogy I give is they're pulling the rabbit out of the hat. Whereas what we want to do is, as much as possible, follow a objective, repeatable process that considers all of these parameters that we've talked through. What I won't work through this in each point, just conscious of time. Happy to share this afterwards, and if you guys want to convert it into local language or something like that as a tool. But this flow chart is considering, does it meet the definition of a control, ensuring it's not a support activity or verification activity. It also considers, does it meet our threshold for control effectiveness, and then ask some other questions around some of those definition aspects. So probably the question is, for those that do have critical controls, have they applied some type of framework or decision-making process that's repeatable to identify what their critical controls are? And that could just be a yes/no response. Carlos is a yes.
Any answers? Yeah. Coming some yes, yes. Yep. A few yes
Okay.
coming through.
That is very good. Okay. So we've talked about now the process to identify the critical controls. The next part is, well, what does good look like in relation to implementation of those critical controls? Because it might be one thing to have them written down on a piece of paper, but if they're not effectively implemented, then they're just words on a piece of paper. So I'll cover off some aspects here, which I'm just going to minimize you guys. There we go. So one of the items here is ensuring that, let's say the example critical control is, let me just think of an example. Let's say that one of our critical controls is the smoke detectors are fitted to all of our buildings, as an example. So then I would be looking inside our safety and health management system and identifying, well, where should we be calling out either critical controls in general or that specific critical control? So if I said, for example, smoke detectors are fitted to all buildings, then I would expect in the fire procedure, we talk about that as one of our controls. Then in our maintenance management system, I would expect that there's some type of check set up around monitoring those particular controls. In relation to critical controls in general, what good looks like is we'd expect to see information inside the incident reporting and investigation procedure that calls out specifically around any incidents or things where we might have a failure of the control, ensuring that our investigations also confirm and check on the performance of a critical control. And if a critical control was found to be deficient, then that's also explored. We'd expect to see in the risk management process or procedure that talks about critical controls and how they're part of the framework. We would be looking inside the change management process to see, is the organization aware and prompt for if there might be a change that might introduce a critical risk or might impact on a critical control. And in our health and safety reporting procedure or framework, that we're monitoring and reporting on the health of our critical controls. What else do I want to talk about? So the action management system, So actions assigned where critical controls are seen to be deficient, or there might be actions assigned to for people to go out and check on critical controls. So here's just some examples of embedding within systems. Maybe a question to the group is there anything that I've just been through here that they can see as a gap in their own organization in terms of a management system and embedding within? It's a pretty complex question, but interested to see if anyone has any insights into that. You go for sure. Nice. Francisco, risk management procedure. Yeah. Does anyone else have any other insight? Yes, Carlos, change management. Awesome. Okay, thank you. Right, so part of what good looks like is there are clear accountabilities for roles that have a part to play in the critical control management process. So we may have critical risk owners, critical control owners, people who do verification of critical controls. Are they named? Are those people trained? Are they clear on what they need to do in their roles? For frontline supervisors, what is their role in the critical control management process? Have we clearly defined that? What does that look like? So that's the roles, and then the systems that support that could be in, do we have authorizations for holding a role? Is it you are now a critical control owner, go off and do this? Or some organizations have a formal appointment where they say, you are a critical control owner, here are your responsibilities, sign off that you accept these responsibilities. So it's a formal appointment. The work planning process. So are we, as part of our work planning process, so let's say our technical design people who are setting out our plan or our production plan, are we aware of where there may be critical risks in the execution of that plan? And therefore, are we aware of where we may need to ensure critical controls are in place? So instead of waiting for the frontline person to think about what are the critical controls, could the work planning process help people who use the work planning process know what are the critical risks, know what are the critical controls? And our risk management processes, do they align to or complement our critical controls? So for example, if I need to do a job safety analysis, I think that's, I don't know what the term is in Brazil, does it prompt me to consider what may be the critical risks and critical controls associated to this task? So that might be another question back to the group. After going through this content, can anyone see any gaps or opportunities within their own business? Job safety, APT. Okay. Yeah. APT stands for something.
Yeah, good question. I don't remember anymore. I just remember the name.
That's fine.
Job safe
Okay.
analysis.
Yeah.
No, yeah, in Portuguese.
Don't remember seeing Bruce Jones. Okay.
Análise preliminar de risco, APR.
Exato.
Exatamente.
Exato.
Análise de risco
Yeah,
de tarefa, tem de tudo.
APR.
APT. Okay, thank you. Okay, lots of words here. What this is pointing to is what good looks like is for each critical control, there is a performance standard. And the purpose of a performance standard is to clearly define the operation of the critical control. So for example, if one of our critical controls was the smoke detectors in the roof, then within the performance standard, I would be answering things like its availability, its reliability, what redundancies it might have, how we want it to function, its timing aspects, um, also how it might fail and what we've got in place to stop it from failing, key training and competencies, a number of those aspects. So things we have in place to ensure the performance of the critical control right now. And then the second part is defining what are the checks we're going to do on the critical control. So let's say if it was the smoke detectors in the roof, and I've defined how we want it to perform. And one of the things we do is a monthly fire inspection by the fire specialist. Then one of my checks I might do is every 6 months is go and review all of these monthly fire reports to check, are they being performed? Have all of the performance parameters been met? Were there any failures and things like that? So that's the whole purpose of a performance standard. Normally we spend half a day in our training on this, so that's all I'll say about that. So are we able to do a quick yes, no in terms of who has performance standards in their organizations for their critical controls? Quick poll. No.
Boa pergunta. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
It's in capitals too. That was a strong no. Okay. Nice. Okay. Thank you for those insights. And this is just visually representing that we may have heard of these terms of critical control verifications or critical control monitoring or critical control inspections. And this is visually showing that these discrete inspections and verifications that we might do on these critical controls all come from the design of the performance standard. So we could have one critical control performance standard for one critical control, and we might have 3, 4, 5 different checks or verification activities we might do in relation to this one critical control. And so that's why when we work with clients, we want to make sure they only define the critical few critical controls because of how much work happens downstream. And this is where we can overwhelm our organizations, is if we have too many critical controls and we don't do the implementation work very well. You would not be surprised how many organizations don't do this well, but have we told the workforce what are their critical controls? What are their critical risks? Do they know what they are? How do we communicate that information? How do we continuously communicate that information? Could be in pre-shift meetings, could be in our risk management processes, could be formal training, could be through supervision. So that's some other areas of what good looks like is everyone top to bottom is clear on what the critical risks are, what are the critical controls, and more importantly, the workforce have some toll gates when a critical control is not in place. They know of that and the work does not proceed. Reporting. So do we have reports on our critical controls? If we're monitoring, what's the health of them? How do we know what their health is? And are we able to see that as a collective? This might be another question for the group is, does anyone do any reporting on their critical controls at the moment? Or critical risks, but maybe critical controls? Yes, yes, yes. Okay, some yeses are good for those. Monthly. That is excellent. Yeah, well, we'll get to those questions shortly. I'm really keen to dive into them because I'm curious. Okay, and does the organization have a process in place so that if we proactively identify an issue with a control? So let's say, for example, I did a verification on these smoke monitors, and it showed that two of the smoke monitors weren't working. So I've proactively identified a deficiency in the critical control. What do I do? What happens next? And that's what this is also showing, is we could have the wording here as critical control failed. Now, it could be through proactively, we go out and do checks and inspections, but also it could be reactively where we've had an incident and it's been clear that a critical control has failed. So I don't know, we had an actual fire or something like that. So on either of those, proactive identification or reactive, how do we then make sense of and evaluate them in the same, through a similar level of objectiveness? And the pathway that we help our clients do is we say, okay, for either way in, review the actual or potential consequence of the failure. And if it was of a level 4 or 5, this is just general levels here. So let's say most industries, level 4 is if a potential fatality, and level 5 could be multiple fatality. So if the failure could have resulted in a level 4 or level 5, go and do your standard incident reporting and investigation process like you would for a standard potential level 4 or level 5. If in this decision point we said, oh, look, there was one, we identified that someone wasn't trained in working on the smoke detector, but there wasn't really a risk of fatality. It was just we hadn't met that criteria. Then we might say, no, there wasn't an actual level 4 or level 5 risk, but within our performance standard, we've talked about what we do. And it could be, it's a simple action that go and make sure our training's updated to ensure everyone's trained, and that's it. To assess both what you find during your inspections and what happens during incidents, and how do you then manage them and investigate them without doing too much. So in Queensland mining, when the draft legislation said that every mine site would need to inform the regulator if there was a failure of a critical control, then that might have meant that every time they go out and inspect something, that if they find that it's not working, that could be classed as a failure. And if that wording had have remained, then it could have been like 5,000 reports going through the regulator each month because we've found a failure of the critical control. So thankfully that wording's been adjusted or removed, but it's important that your organization doesn't do the same thing and then we're trying to do way too much stuff. Okay, so rounding out this bit, even on time, yeah, we're good. So identifying critical controls, there's a structured process that we need to follow to get to the point. So that was that flowchart view. We know that we need to measure the effectiveness of all of our controls before we work out, is this going to be critical or not? There's a number of aspects to successful implementation, and one of them is a critical control performance standard. And we know when we looked at the implementation is we need to ensure it's embedded in all of our different management systems. It just can't be written into a procedure somewhere. Okay, so the third bit of content is relatively short, and then we can move into question and answer. Everyone won't be able to read this. So the Queensland mining industry has had legislation that's been in place since 1999 from a from an act perspective, and then in 2017 it modified its regulations. And in relation to critical risk management, it hasn't used that terminology. All it has used is principal hazards. And principal hazards generally mean those types of risks that could result in a multiple fatality outcome. And the wording traditionally has been, if you have a principal hazard, you need to do a risk assessment on it and also have a management plan for how you manage that. And for some principal hazards, the legislation has been prescriptive and said you must have a principal hazard, for example, a strata failure. So let's say a collapse of a mine, or a fire or explosion risk. From underground mining, it could be, what's an example here is a release of gas or things like that. So the legislation's been both risk-based and prescriptive. So prescriptive in here's a list, but also if there's more than that list, go off and do a risk assessment. Variation in application of that. In light of the fatalities that have happened recently in the mining industry, and there's been some mine fires and things like that in Queensland mining, they have now built into the legislation that will go live in 2026. So they've released it now. In 2025, June, the window of implementation, so you have a year to get it in place. And some of the main elements they're saying is, well, they've put into the legislation what a critical control is. They've put into the legislation event is, and being clear on that. And they essentially want the organisations to determine what is a material unwanted event. They need to set the threshold. They've said that you need to, so there's the idea of officers of corporations. So what that means is it's not just people on the mine site need to know about critical controls and how well they're going. It's also people that work in corporate offices, or might be directors or boards or things like that. They're extending the obligations into those worlds as well. So not knowing or not being aware is no longer a defense. If you're not on site, it doesn't mean that you don't have a obligation here. So I think that's a good thing. And it means that you need to put critical controls inside your safety and health management system. It needs to be in part of your risk management system as well. So that's what's changing in Queensland mining. My opinion is I think it's a good thing because it will ensure the focus on these unwanted events. So these big ticket items and critical controls. The risk is, and I'm already seeing it, is everyone will do it differently. Everyone will have a different interpretation. Potentially the regulator will have a different interpretation as well. And they may regulate and make some decisions and give some direction that might differ from a purist perspective. And also what I envisage may happen as well is people will wait up until June 2026 and then realize they don't have anything in place and then rush in a off-the-shelf package of critical controls and risk assessments and then tick the box, but the effectiveness will be questionable at best. So I think it's a good thing if it's done the right way. And that's what I'm doing my hardest here in Australia is pointing out these risks of doing it wrong and trying to get everyone on the same page. So rounding out this bit of content is, legislation, good if implemented well in a strategic way.
Beautiful.
Okay. So this one, this is now a question back to everyone, is from the content that we've been through, what is one thing that's stood out for them as a learning, a gap, an aha moment? I'm happy to take some time here because this is where we can reflect on stuff.
If anybody wants to drop a message there in Portuguese, we can translate afterwards. That's fine.
Absolutely. Yeah. What's been something that stood out for them?
Oh, some answer is popping up.
Process operations the same. Yeah, nice. It's mentioned that we need to have procedures and limits critical equipment, etc. Should we prioritize? Oh, that's a good question. I like that. So yeah, prompt for anyone else. Is anything falling out as a key point or an opportunity or a takeaway? We'll give some time in the chat anyway when I ask that.
Yeah.
All right, so we've gone through the key learnings here, and obviously the slide pack I'll share with you guys, and if we want to convert it into local language, we can do that.
Thank you.
To get that to everyone. Covered off a bit of content, and so obviously what we do for a lot of the people that jump onto webinars, sometimes there's like, wow, there's so much to do here, or I've done a little bit, but I haven't done that bit. And there's obviously two ways to do it, which is I call it the slow way or the fast way. So one could be the way that I've been doing it for the last 10 years, where you learn some stuff, you try some stuff, you improve it, and then you keep going through to eventually get it to a point. What we are doing now for a lot of people that jump onto our webinars, and we've only launched it this week actually in Australia, is I've taken everything I've got in relation to critical control management and I've put it onto an online module, which we call a critical control accelerator workshop. So it might be a language thing here that maybe I'll work with you guys if some people are interested, where we pretty much all of the different templates and tools that I've just gone through, we've put into there all of the how-to guides in how to do all those activities. We've got, because a lot of people ask us for our list of generic critical controls from our last 5 years or 6 years of work as well. So if some organizations don't have anything in place, then sometimes we say, we'll just start with this to at least fill the gap to give you time to go through the full process. So if you put the link in there, it might have been the one before that. There you go. Thanks, Paolo. So I encourage people, if they're interested, click on the link. And I wish it had been around 10 years ago when I was around, because you've shortcutted the time frame. You don't need to pay expensive consultants like myself to come to your site and do it for you. You can literally go and do it yourself. So something like $100 as opposed to 100K. And you can get started immediately. So I'm certainly making that available to the people on the line. So that is all the content I now have. Hopefully the pace was okay and it wasn't too much or too heavy. And now happy to move into Q&A for as long as people are happy to stay on the line.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Christian. I think it was extremely insightful. Another information I'd like to share with everybody is this presentation. In a couple of weeks, we'll be publishing or sharing on YouTube. So we'll try to get the subtitles as well. Just one thing, like out of this conversation, some time ago, Andrew Hopkins, he made several really important recommendations, especially after a major event that happened in Brazil. And I feel like the Brazilian industry really came on the other side, came up on the other side way better, way more mature, I think. And this content really adds to what he said, because one of the key recommendations was we need to sort of prioritize what really matters, and our critical controls, whether you come to a critical control from a process safety perspective or through this process you just introduced us to, will be way better, in a way that better position to really allocate our resource and time to what really adds value to our organization. One question I have here before we extend, in regard to what is your view for the in-field verifications? Who should be conducting them? Should sit with EHS people? Should be senior leaders? What is your
Excellent
take?
question. Excellent question. And it's not, unsurprisingly, it's not a neat answer. So one of the considerations here is how prescriptive is the verification. So I'll give you an example. If my the critical control example I use is the smoke detector in the roof. If the critical control verification said, go and check the effectiveness of the smoke detector, then that would then rely on the ability of the verifier in terms of what technical knowledge do they have about smoke detectors. What does effectiveness look like? Well, what's the criteria? Well, I need to determine that based on my expertise. Whereas if the question set said you need to do a verification on the availability of the smoke detectors for the last 6 months, our target is 100%. Go and look at all the fire records for the last 6 months, review each of those, and look for where availability was 100%. Where it was 100%, that's a pass. If there are any instances where it had failed, that's a fail, and then record your findings. So that essentially is a mini work instruction of how to do a verification. Do I then need to be a subject matter expert in fire extinguishers, in fire, smoke detectors to do that? No, I don't. So one of the themes here is if we do the design work on verifications to be almost a mini work instruction, then the pool in which we can use to perform the verification opens up. We don't need to rely on technical experts because they're the only ones that know how to do that thing. So that's one aspect here. That's one variable. Then the second part is what you're talking about is, well, what organizational level performs that? So if it's written as a work instruction, does that mean that anyone from frontline worker through to the board of directors could execute that verification? Yes, they could. Then it starts to get more into what the organization's appetite is for who they would allow to do it. From my perspective, if I had my choice, I would be like, get your frontline workers out doing them because they are closest to it. They'll give you the best intelligence. Generally, what happens is we put it at a superintendent, let's say, I don't know what the Portuguese equivalent is of that, but normally at a superintendent level, who are already busy. It all comes to them at the end of the month, and they just rush through it, do the tick, and then move on. That was a really long response, mate, to your question, but hopefully that helps.
No, was good to sort of give us some ideas about how to introduce that to our workforce. And also, I think you have touched base on this quickly, but if you can suggest some process how we can incorporate critical control management into our investigation process, and what value do you see in doing so?
Yeah. How can we incorporate critical control management into the incident investigation process? Yeah, awesome. Let me just think on that. So as part of I'll talk about the process and then we'll assume that that's documented inside the procedure. So as part of our data gathering, straight away we'd be wanting to know, is this incident, was it in relation to a critical risk, and or were there any critical controls relevant to this incident? And if there were any critical controls relevant to this incident, how did they perform? Did they perform as intended? Because that could be a good thing, and we want to acknowledge that. Or did they not perform as intended? They either failed or just didn't do fully what we wanted it to do. If we identify that as part of our data gathering, then we must also include an assessment or a further investigation into why in and around that. So let's say we do our investigation, then what we need to do as part of that, let's assume the critical control failed. As part of our investigation process, we then need to go back to our risk management tools and go and update them and plug the gaps. So for example, in our bow tie, we mightn't have identified a particular cause, or we mightn't have identified that, might have said, okay, this is the critical control, but it might have been a way that the critical control failed we didn't identify as part of our risk assessment process. So we need to go back and update that. Or it could have been that our verification process, we identified if we had had an extra check on this thing, then maybe this wouldn't have happened. So summarizing that, the investigation process should prompt, was there a critical risk or critical control associated? If there was, evaluate the performance. If performance was less than adequate, then what do we need to update on our risk assessment side of things to go and fill the void?
Nice. Thank you. I think,
Okay.
yeah, Bill.
Well, I think we are driving to the end. I think we have 4 more minutes, so I will make one of the questions from the chat, and I will add one of mine as well. So, Chris, the question from the chat is, how do we guarantee or how do we check if the effectiveness of the critical controls remains on time? Since the time goes, probably if the situation changes, how do we check if the control is still in place and being effective? And before finishing, I think that it's a really structured presentation and also the system you put together. So congratulations on this. It has start, begin, middle, and finish, and then an end. It's clear to identify, and it's not easy. We have a consultancy company, and we know how difficult it is to put together such a logical system together. So congratulations on this, and thank you again for accepting our invitation.
We'll answer the last bit first. You're welcome. I love this stuff and more than happy to talk about it. So the question is, how do we ensure the critical control stays in place over time?
Exactly.
Yep. So the main mechanism is through our critical control verifications. So I gave the example before where I might check the fire records every 6 months. I will do that same check every 6 months into perpetuity or until there's a change to the regime. So we set up critical control verifications and they continue on a recurring frequency. And that then points to the importance of the change management process. If we change something, or if we change smoke alarms and put in something else, then ensure that flows into the critical control management framework as well. So that will then adjust accordingly. I'm also happy to stay on the line. I don't know if you guys have a hard stop, but I'm happy to stay on the line after the end if there's more questions as well. I'm more than happy to do that.
You want to make one or Duca?
Eu quero fazer uma pergunta.
Vai lá.
Tendo que as análises de riscos são a coluna vertebral da nossa gestão de riscos críticos, eu queria que você pudesse nos emprestar um pouquinho os seus óculos, a sua percepção, e indicasse o que você já viu, ou quando você vai numa empresa que você vê que as análises de risco elas não estão sendo efetivas, não estão gerando valor segurança? O que que demonstra? Porque eu acho que isso é uma questão de muitos nós aqui, de ver se as nossas análises de risco realmente estão sendo análises de risco, se elas têm substrato, se elas têm corpo efetivo. Então é isso.
That's a simple question with a very big
$1
response.
million.
Can I share my screen again? By the way, are you guys happy to continue on? I'm happy to continue on, just in case.
Yeah,
people
probably
have-
another
Okay.
5 should be okay. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Let me go here. Let me find the presentation that we just had up. Okay. So everyone remembers this slide where I talked about when I hear risk analysis, I think about what's the risk assessment tool we use to identify critical controls. In the world I operate in, mostly it's bow tie analysis. So the question here is around where do we go wrong in bow tie analysis that then leads to deficient critical controls? Lots of different ways. And without this becoming a bow tie training course, which we do somewhere else, it even goes, well, start again. We went through some of the principles of a control. So one of the ways it goes wrong is we have controls listed here that don't meet the definition of a control. It could just be, for example, it could be training, and that's all that's listed there. So it's not specific, measurable, and auditable. It's not defined in a management system. So let's say the terminologies just aren't great. We also have controls listed here that are support activities. So we might have supervisor inspections are listed as a control, but it's not actually a true control. It's a verification. Is say supervisor inspections, let's call that a critical control. And then we end up doing all of this verification on supervisor inspections, but it's not, we're doing it on the wrong thing. The other aspect, like I mentioned, is effectiveness assessment. So they might have selected a control that has poor effectiveness and said that's going to be our critical control. So there's some of those. Sometimes I've seen them get wrong in terms of what is the risk itself. So, for example, a bow tie should be described the point in which you've lost control of the energy or lost control of the process. So, in relation to let's think electrical energy, the middle of the bow tie should be something like contact with live electrical conductors. However, I've seen bow ties put the consequence, which is electrocution, and they'll put electrocution in the middle. And therefore, our whole risk assessment, we're in the wrong place. But then we're trying to identify critical controls from that, and it turns into a bit of a cluster. Lots of words there. Hopefully that helps in response to your question.
That's a good one. So I have to take one more. There's a question here which is really interesting. Does a control need to be high in the hierarchy of controls to be considered as a critical control? And also, do we need critical controls for every single critical risk?
So let's start with the second part first. Do we need critical controls for every single critical risk? What's the quick way of answering this or giving a response to this? Part of this will be due to, hang on, I'm just going to share again. It's easier to talk to an image.
Yeah.
Share, let me go back. Okay. So what you can see here is a consequence matrix. And in here, this red line represents a threshold. So what's our level of threshold that above which we have that consequence that's material and below which we say it's not material? So if an it will now depend on where the organization sets its red line. So if an organization set its red line at lost time injury, and there's a particular risk that could lead to a lost time injury, does that mean you need to have a critical for that? I would probably argue maybe you don't. But if an organization said their red line was set at single fatality, then I would argue, yeah, you probably should. What you can do though is you can adjust how many critical controls you have based on the nature of the risk. Say, for example, if one of the risks is, let's say, vehicle collision on a mine site, that's a high likelihood type of risk. So I might have 7 critical controls for that, whereas another critical risk might be a snake bite, which is a low likelihood event, and I might have 1 critical control. So maybe instead of it being in or out, it could be around, well, how many relative to the likelihood and consequence of that. It's a good question.
Thank you.
Right.
I think we are coming to the end now. I think we can wrap up. But again, Chris, appreciate it. Juval, Hugo, Duca, would like to add
Yeah.
anything?
Just quickly, so you
Uh-huh.
put the link to my LinkedIn. If anyone wants to connect with me on LinkedIn, and they'll see all my stuff and we can keep chatting about it. All right, back to you guys.
Thank you. And yes, please get in touch with Christian. He's also running several webinars, free webinars, monthly base. So, and he's free to and really keen to go to Brazil. So,
All right. So, Paulo, final question. Chris, how do you deliver the content, for example, for consultancy clients? Is it an app? Is it a Excel spreadsheet? How do you use it? Or the company provides it the way they think it's better? I mean, the whole hierarchy, like setting the controls, putting everything that you showed.
So your questions around how do we deliver our service in relation to critical risk management? It depends. However, generally it's a mixture of off-site technical work and on-site facilitation. So some organizations might have safety people on site who can facilitate things, and we will do the technical design and hand it over to site, and then they can facilitate. Some organizations say, you, Christian, just do everything. Just do some stuff from home, come to our site, do some stuff, whatever you need to do. Or sometimes we just have an advisory service where the client does their thing and they use us as a sounding board for as they go through the process.
Perfect. Thank you.
Also, probably worth mentioning too that if you guys send me the questions that we haven't answered, I'll put some stuff together and send it back so we don't have that drop off.
Excelente, Chris. Muito bom.
Yeah.
E o Paulo colocou também aqui o link para a sua empresa. E eu tô colocando aqui mais uma vez para todo mundo. Deixa eu colar aqui. Impress Solutions. Tá aí no chat. Faz uma visitinha, pessoal, ao site do Chris. Muito interessante. Gente, eu tô dando graças a Deus, Chris, que isso aqui está sendo gravado, porque eu preciso assistir isso tudo de novo, com calma, numa posição mais relaxada, deitado na minha cama, na televisão maior, né? Porque a gente está aqui organizando, olhando para o chat, olhando para não sei o que e tal. Mas muitíssimo obrigado, Cris. Material de muita densidade, muito conteúdo aqui. E você foi muito generoso, né? Em, inclusive, extrapolar o horário, tá? Muitíssimo obrigado. Isso vai ter um impacto muito interessante. Muito em breve eu vou colocar no nosso canal do YouTube. Muita gente vai assistir, tá? E vai ter um impacto muito grande na comunidade de segurança aqui do Brasil.
Agradecer
Gente,
o
Um tema
Felipe.
muito importante.
fala.
Agradecer o Felipão, né? Não, só agradecer o Felipe aí pelo trabalho de sempre. Aí. Obrigado, Felipe.
Felipe é
Nosso
fantástico,
tradutor.
gente. Nosso tradutor oficialíssimo. Muitíssimo obrigado. Mais uma vez, obrigado, Paulo, por ter nos introduzido o Christian, né? Muito bom. Obrigado, Gustavo Duca, por ter participado aqui conosco. A gente estava com saudade de você, tá?
Muito só.
Também estava.
Muito bem. Gente, muitíssimo obrigado pela participação de todos. Desejo a todos uma excelente noite. Aqui é noite, aqui no Brasil, Chris. Estamos perto das 9 da noite, né? Eu nem jantei ainda, vou jantar agora. Boa
Bye bye.
noite, gente, e até uma
Até a
próxima.
próxima.
Valeu mesmo.